Hello, everyone. I'm Kari Vogelgesang, your host of the Educator Wellness Podcast, here to share and promote my life's work and passion, all things wellness. But not just any wellness, we're here to discuss wellness specifically as it pertains to educators. I am a former elementary school teacher, and I am passionate about helping educators see wellness in a very different way. This podcast is dedicated to educators across the globe, creating a space for us to come together in an authentic and therapeutic way, sharing our stories, our hopes, our joys, our fears, our sorrows, and hopefully creating some space to share some laughter with one another as well. In our journey to learn how to support one another to prioritize wellness and enhance our overall well-being. Please join me as we talk with nationally recognized experts to guide us on a transformative journey of self-discovery, helping us to embrace and weave all dimensions of wellness into the fabric of both our personal and professional lives. Also, please note that the opinions and perspectives that are shared on this podcast do not necessarily represent those of the Scanlon Center for School Mental Health or the University of Iowa. Today, I have the privilege of talking with Dr. Erika Bocknek, an expert on all things emotional intelligence. Dr. Erika is a university professor, family therapist, and mom of three. She holds a master's degree in couples and family therapy, a doctorate in child development, and two postdoctoral fellowships in child psychiatry and infant mental health. She is the associate editor of the Infant Mental Health Journal and serves on the editorial boards of Adversity and Resilient Science and Infancy. She has published over 50 peer-reviewed research papers and book chapters for professional audiences, including a forthcoming chapter in the updated World Association for Infant Mental Health Handbook and the Social and Emotional Development of Young Children. Dr. Bocknek has also written articles for parents that have been seen in PBS NewsHour, MarketWatch, the San Francisco Chronicle, and Kevlar. She is a well-regarded trainer and has taught audiences as diverse as the psychology department at Children's Hospital of Michigan, early childhood educators in Metro Detroit, family court judges across the state of Michigan, and the Detroit Pistons marketing department. Dr. Bocknek's research emphasizes family and community indicators of resilience that buffer the impacts of trauma and the social and emotional development of children. So whether you're an educator, a school administrator, a parent, a student, or simply someone who is passionate about the transformative power of better understanding emotions and learning, you're in the right place. Get ready for a candid conversation that offers practical tips that have the potential to improve your personal life and enhance your teaching skills and create a positive ripple effect in the lives of your students and families. Welcome, Dr. Erika Bocknek. Welcome to the show, and I am so excited to be chatting with you today. We have some shared friends or colleagues, and so I've only briefly met you once before this, but I've heard really wonderful things. I've read about you, and I'm so excited that you were able to take some time to join us today and to focus on a conversation that is all about emotional intelligence. But first, before we get into it, can you just tell us a little bit about yourself?
Yes, absolutely. Hi, Dr. Kari. I'm so excited to be here. We've been talking about this conversation, and I'm really excited that we're here and we're having it. My name is Dr. Erika Bocknek. I am, first of all, this is the most important thing I do. I'm a mom of three. I'm a Midwestern mom of three and a Jewish mom. I am a family therapist. And I am also an academic, and I have a long program of research on emotional development in the childhood years.
Yeah, you have a very long history of this. I know many of you just listened to Dr. Bocknek's bio, and it's quite impressive. So I feel like you are just the person we need to talk to right now about emotional intelligence, what it is, why people are talking about it, how it impacts our lives, all of that. So let's go ahead and just start with maybe the most basic question, can you share your definition of emotional intelligence and why
Well,
you believe? Oh, go ahead.
no, I'm sorry. Please go ahead.
No,
Please
no.
finish the question.
Let's just go ahead and start right there. Like, let's just stop right there. Can you share your definition of emotional intelligence with us?
Absolutely. And in this question, I actually hear two things.
Okay.
One is, what do we sort of agree on as a field is emotional intelligence? And typically, what we're talking about are skill-based kinds of things that help people to effectively engage in human interactions. Now, the reason I say that that's kind of the field definition is because when you really take that apart, you can see that we've gone kind of quickly and said, oh, well, it's these 5 things, right? And so the field tends to really focus on self-regulation, communication skills, peer-to-peer, what I call kind of rules of politeness, and having what we call emotional awareness. And again, this is all through a filter, right? But we tend to talk about that as being able to label your feelings, being able to recognize what you're feeling in the service of behavioral self-regulation. Now,
Okay.
yeah, please go ahead.
No, go ahead.
Now, for me, where I've really liked to get kind of wonky about this and really take that definition out and look at it and say, is this what I think it means to be emotionally intelligent? What I'm really starting to ask is, okay, so those are important skills in some moments, in some environments for the service of some goals. But what we may be leaving out of the equation is, how do we separate these ideas about what is skill-based and what represents a true intelligence quotient, right? So as a parallel, when we talk about IQ, sort of more academic oriented intelligence, we're really talking about two different things in terms of what we measure. We're talking about capacity. And so that's things like problem solving, the ability to think expansively about problems, to be able to self-regulate in a way that you can attack problems and apply skills that you have. And then we're also talking about things like crystallized knowledge, which is essentially retaining information that somebody has given to you in some way.
Sure.
And so I like to take apart EQ in the same way. Yes, self-regulation is like crystallized knowledge in that there are ways to self-regulate that are sort of applicable, context specific. And that is a set of skills people need. But what would it really mean to be emotionally intelligent? And so that's a very long, windy way of saying I'm really thinking a lot about empathy and empathic development these days as the central marker of what it means to be emotionally intelligent.
Yeah, that's interesting that you say that. I co-wrote a curriculum over the summer with 3 of my colleagues here at the University of Iowa. And it's a school mental health curriculum, but one of the central components of this curriculum is empathy and broaching conversations, particularly conversations connected to mental health, or challenges that students are facing, and how around centering empathy in those conversations and the way you broach the conversation, do a warm handoff to a school mental health expert or provider within the system. So empathy is definitely something that we've been thinking a lot about over here as well, and some of the work that we're doing. I guess first of all, I really appreciate your thorough response and where you kind of took us there and thinking about 2 different things. And I'm going to come back to that in just a little bit. But if we can rewind even maybe just a little bit more, can you tell us why you believe emotional intelligence is so important in various aspects of our lives? Like, who cares? Who cares if you can accurately identify emotions? I mean, does it really matter?
Well, to me, it's actually a separate question of whether or not you can really identify emotions and if that matters. And I'm happy to answer that separately.
Okay.
But let me, because I'm a little more agnostic about that one actually than you might expect me to be.
Oh, I can't wait for that answer.
Yeah. But why do we need to be empathetic? Why do we need to grow capacities in a social and emotional functioning? The reason is that human beings were never meant to do great things in life on our own. That is an aspirational value that some nations, some cultural groups may hold. The Greek philosophers, for example, were really into that idea. But the ways that we are, designed as humans is inherently about collaborative and flexible relational functioning. The superpower of humans, what it really means to be human, is that we have this really complicated, complex, emotional and intuitive detection system. And we engage in relational functioning to drive our communities forward. Yeah. So it's really so the answer is that emotional intelligence is at the heart of literally everything humans do. And the greatest leaders are people who have high emotional intelligence. And actually, I'll even replace the word greatest with most impactful.
Yeah. Yep. Because you can be a leader, right? That gets things done, that can make sure that projects are executed and completed. But I agree with you. I think that's a better term. We've all been part of teams, right? Where like maybe we've been like really high producers, but we also want the hell out of there. We don't want to stay.
Well, and I think too, I want to differentiate too. It's somewhat of a neutral idea to have emotional intelligence, even though it sounds like that would inherently make you somebody who's caring and who is kind of human-centered. It's much more neutral than that. So there's great examples of leaders throughout history who have used their capacity for really relating and creating affiliation for missions and means that perhaps in hindsight we wouldn't have agreed we should have affiliated with.
Yeah. Okay, so let's shift just a little bit and talk about, in your experience with emotional intelligence, how does it contribute to effective communication, both in somebody's personal life and their professional life? Does it?
Yes. I'm pausing a bit because I think it does. And yet what is true about communication is that it's not driven by a single person. So what emotional intelligence really does for us, and by the way, kids do this much better than adults, is it gives us the capacity to listen and learn from channels of communication that are not only verbal. It means that we're able to understand meaning as it's communicated across different channels of communication.
Why do you think kids are better at this than we are?
Well, I think there's two answers to that. One is what we're able to draw from neurological evidence. And we know that children are relying on their short-term memory far more than their long-term memory. And in adulthood, that's flipped. And the reason is that the brain sort of does what it needs to do in every moment, in every life stage. We have this kind of way of thinking about the brain as though it's on a linear trajectory, and that's not exactly true. In childhood, children are really primed to be paying attention to all channels of communication because the central goals of childhood require them to be listening and learning from their people all the time. Now, I think there's an argument to be made. And so then in adulthood, what we're really doing to learn and even solve problems tends to be either reaching back into our own long-term memory bank. How did I solve this before? And or accessing someone else's long-term memory bank. We're doing a lot less of sort of showing up in the environment and observing and taking information in a quick way. Now, think so. I think that there is an argument to be made that this is intentional by design, that we need to do either more often in each life stage based on the demands. I also think there's an argument to be made that this is all about socialization patterns.
Hmm.
And we actually should have sort of higher firing short-term memory throughout our lifespan, but we sort of erode that capacity in favor for this sort of emphasis on long-term memory.
Okay. That's super interesting to me too, because, one of the things that we try so hard, that I have been trying personally, I guess, so hard to do is like to stay in the moment and to really listen and to not allow my brain to like skip ahead 4 or 5 steps. And so I'm wondering now, I'm thinking to myself, like, okay, so like there is some like real purpose and meaning behind this in terms of like really trying to block things out when I'm having a conversation with somebody, right? And really focus on their facial expressions, their body language. I believe this is what you're telling me, right? And what they're truly saying and trying to communicate to me before I even respond.
Yeah, I think that's a big part of it. And really being able to pay attention to all those levels of communication. But I think the other thing is sort of showing up in the first place with a stance of curiosity, right? Sometimes we do that really intentional listening, but we have already put ourselves in a tunnel. We already think the purpose of the conversation is one thing or another. And so even when we believe we are working really hard to pay attention, we are probably shutting out pieces of information that we are not aware align with our goal and or may not align with our goal. But what children are doing that's very different is they don't have that kind of hidden curriculum internalized already that only some things matter. They're listening and learning all the time. It's why sometimes conversations with young children, they go off in the most wonderful tangents, right? Early childhood educators like me thrive in that kind of an environment. It's also, by the way, we're starting to encroach into differences in neurotypical versus neurodivergent ways of knowing, learning, interacting. And so, yes, to what you described, we want to pay attention to more than words as children do, but it's even sort of the first place showing up with the idea that there are things to be learned here. And my role is to ask questions and wonder.
Yeah, ask those questions. Okay, so let's talk a little bit more about empathy and the role that empathy might play in emotional intelligence. So, how can individuals enhance their ability to understand and connect with the emotions of others?
Okay, so this is such a great conversation. I'm really excited. So you probably know, as a fellow academic, that there's a million definitions of empathy in the literature. This is sort of an ongoing thing, right? That
Yeah.
we are having a lot of dialogue about this as scientists. And it's something I really love about the science, that there is this kind of written dialogue always going on. What happens in this world that I think is also interesting in the way that it expands conversation, but sometimes problematic, is that a cross section of that dialogue gets sort of pulled and put into the popular discourse on social media, for example. And then everybody has agreed that this is a universality. And we're still over here going, well, maybe it's this and maybe it's that. And let me talk about this part of it. And so this has very much happened with empathy. When most people hear that word, they think about behaviors, providing care, behaving in a compassionate way, even finding points to relate is a behavior, being tender. These are all parts of the empathetic system. They're all manifestations of empathy, but they are not necessarily what empathy is. What empathy is, as foundationally, is the ability to have an awareness of my own human complexity, which means I have some, at least moderate, let's say. I'm an anti-perfectionist. So I've like just, some level of awareness that I have internal states. Feelings are only one.
Mm.
I have some awareness of internal states. I feel things, I think things, I have beliefs and motivations, and they are all mine. They are uniquely, sort of coalescing and creating in my own life and context, my own unique experiences. Because I know that, because I have that level of self-awareness, I sit on the other side of a conversation with someone, and I already know that that's true about the other person. They have had a totally separate lifetime of experiences. And that is true even if I'm starting to note commonalities.
Mm-hmm.
I still have to hold in mind that their set overall is unique. Even twins raised in the same home have unique sets of experiences, at least to some degree. And so because I'm aware that my thoughts, feelings, beliefs are all mine, and I'm aware the other person has thoughts, feelings, and beliefs that are all theirs, now I have a starting point where I'm able to say we are each humans. We each have these internal states that are shaped in the similar sort of broad way, which is through experience. And I'm not at a starting point where I'm saying we have to find a point of common ground in order to provide care, compassion, support, curiosity, interest. You see how there's so many ways empathy can really go once you establish that as a starting point. But without that starting point, when people are trying to establish compassion, what they typically over rely on is pity, which is very incomplete. Adults especially do this with kids, and pity really burns out the motor. And the second thing that people over rely on is the ability to relate. And that is something especially that I find is a fallacy of the neurotypical world. Neurotypical people do a lot of labor to establish empathy because they don't start in the place that says we're unique and different. They need us to be the same in some way. So they're doing all this labor when someone's talking to put on what they're saying. I like to say like a hat, like you're trying it on. And you are doing all this labor to say, what would it be like if I wore this hat? Would I have the same experiences if I wore this hat? Do I like this hat? Does it feel comfortable to me? Before you give it back and have sort of a way to understand the truth of the hat.
Yeah.
And it's just so much more labor than being able to say, I believe you. Tell me more. What don't I know? The other thing about over relying on relatability, besides that it's a lot of work, is that it inherently causes you to miss things. If what you're doing as a person's talking is looking for things that are the same, you're missing everything else.
Sure.
You're defining differences as threats to empathy, when actually it's our differences that can create the most humanizing in our interactions with one another.
Yeah, I mean that's really powerful, and thinking about really thinking about those differences, and like you said, that's the most humanizing. It's also something that we end up avoiding the most, and because I think it feels scary for us to go to those places. I do want to go back to something you just said that I think is super interesting, and I'm wondering if you can unpack this for our audience a little bit more. You said pity really burns out the motor.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Yeah. So pity involves, at a basic level, dehumanizing yourself. Now, there's also a lot of dehumanizing that ends up happening when you're pitying someone because you're making them somebody who is sort of trait-based in need, as opposed to thinking about need as a transient state that we all experience. But you're also dehumanizing yourself. And I actually think this is really important because what you're saying is this other person needs care and I don't, which is not true. In any interaction, we both are experiencing this moment. And if I'm going to try to provide love to you by saying that I'm invisible in this relationship, I'm always going to hit a place where I want to be seen. and where I resent and feel frustrated.
Mm. Wow, that's a really another really interesting point about how it's not just dehumanizing the other person. You're really taking away from yourself and the needs that you have as well. Um, Very interesting. Okay, so there's this other thing that people talk about and connect emotional intelligence to sometimes, which is this word I'm going to say that I have such a complex relationship with, which is resilience.
Mm.
So, as you know, in the literature, there have been people who have talked about and studied emotional intelligence and its connection to how it relates to resilience. What role can it play in navigating difficult or stressful situations that connect to resiliency?
I think what you are asking, and tell me if I'm getting this wrong, but I think you are saying if stress and even trauma are constant human experiences,
Mm-hmm.
how can we talk about strength and fortitude in that
Mm-hmm.
context? Is that a fair way to repeat back what you're
Yeah, yeah,
asking?
I think that's great. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And what you're referring to, I think, about difficulty with what to call it is that for a long time, resilience existed as a construct that was very sort of individual focused, that some individual people are resilient for sort of reasons about who they are as people, kind of going back to this idea that's very fallible, that we are designed to make our own fate.
Sure.
We also, and I think people like Dr. Ann Maston, for example, who are really big thinkers in this area, are working to evolve the term. But I also think where it's problematic is the very idea that we expect people to keep bouncing back
Yeah.
without changing any of the circumstances that contribute to sort of challenges and problems and oppression and trauma in the first place. I did a panel on this actually years ago with 3 phenomenal Black female scholars. One of them, Dr. Rihanna Anderson, I remember said, a rubber band is designed to stretch, and yet if you keep leaving it in the sun, eventually it doesn't stretch. And then do you call that rubber band less than?
Mm.
So I think ultimately the challenge I give to us as thought leaders, and even I talk with parents about this on a one-on-one level with their own children, if there's a problem, if we're seeing problems show up, and however that is, child behavior, classroom management issues, teacher wellness, if we're seeing problems show up, we have to look outward, upstream, whether that means in time, whether that means at a broader level in the system. And resiliency is actually best served by creating thriving and human-centered systems where people can flourish. And the natural human condition is to flourish when the conditions for our flourishing are just.
Mm. Always say when I'm doing wellness work in schools, I always say, listen, team, you cannot wellness your way out of a toxic environment. There's no amount of self-care. There's no amount of, financial health practices or emotional health practices or skill development that you can do to work your way out of a system that is putting up all kinds of roadblocks and barriers and getting it in your way of achieving a certain level of desired well-being. And so when you are talking about systems and building systems that allow people to be resilient when they need to, that just really hits home and aligns with a lot of the work that we're doing in Scanlon right now as well. And unfortunately, in the world of education, it really does feel right now, Erika, like a lot of those systems are being attacked. And we just keep highlighting all of these little things, not little things, but some of them are quite big actually, that are going wrong within a school, without looking at the broader community and the system in which the school is operating. There's things outside of the school walls that are impacting students and families that, show up within our school building that we don't have a lot of control over.
Mm-hmm,
It's
mm-hmm.
just,
That's right.
at systems level, it's so complicated.
But I do think, I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I do think there is the tendency to say, I know where the fault lines are and I feel powerless.
Yeah.
And so I think what we really need to do, I had sort of two thoughts as I was listening to what you were saying. One is that we have to really think about power as not absolute, not a binary. And what are the changes that we can make? And I'll give an example. I know this is abstract. What are the changes where is our power? What is our power? And how do we use it in the service of communal wellness? And there's lots of great thought leadership on this, especially from Black scholars who have been writing about this and thinking for a long time for us to learn from. The other thing that I think puts kind of a wrench in the system is that there's a lot of great people like yourself who immediately understand that idea that you can't take 6 deep breaths. And all of a sudden, the fact that funding got cut at the state level and is impacting your classroom, all of a sudden that problem goes away. We understand that for ourselves. We understand that for adults. We tend to understand that for the most powerful in any system. Where we tend to have difficulty is how we extend that thinking and how we give freedom for everybody in the system. And that is a mouthful to really talk about how power and minoritization show up. But for the purposes of kind of this being just one conversation and where my own expertise is, what I really want to give voice to is that we never do this for children. Despite our ability to understand systemic pathology as a barrier to individual adaptation, we still are hyper-focused on children controlling their bodies, saying exactly the right words at the right time. I even had a really surprising conversation recently with somebody who maintains a lot of influential status in the trauma-informed world. And I raised the issue that children frequently can't use the bathroom when they want to use the bathroom. And the pushback is, but you don't know what they do in the bathroom. And I was like, I do know, but we really need to think this through about how the most powerless are extended our greatest thinking about what emotional adaptation and wellness looks like.
Oh my gosh, I couldn't agree with you more. I mean, we are seeing chronic attendance truancy issues in this, not even just this country, it's global, actually, the issues that we're seeing. Students aren't showing up to school. And this was something that started before COVID, but of course, COVID blew it up. And I have so many stories and even personal stories of kids that I've talked to who basically say, it's like prison. I'm not going back there. I want to be able to go to the bathroom when I want to go to the bathroom. I want to be able to have more choice about what classes I'm taking. I want to be able, to eat when I want to eat, when I'm hungry, and drink when I want to drink. And, I just think to myself, why in 20 and again, I'm not teacher blaming here. This is like a systems issue that we are just so, we are so we grew up in it. It's the way that we think, the way that we are taught to do school is so ingrained in our culture that it's going to take us a long time to kind of work our way out of this. But I mean, I can tell you that from personal stories, like I said, kids that won't go to school at all in high school, but then they start, post-secondary school where they have way more control over their lives and things are going pretty well. Things are going okay. So that just really hit home to me, and it's something that I'm really, really passionate about. But not to get too far off of our topic, because we're running out of time, and I do want to bring us back to emotional intelligence. And we were talking about kids and thriving in schools and their even desire to show up, let alone learn. So, is there a connection between emotional intelligence and a student's ability to learn?
Yes. So if we think broadly about this idea that emotional intelligence is the capacity to honor and know myself as a human, maintain an awareness that other people are human, that humanizing aspect in relationships is the most important foundation for learning. Again, we're very reliant on behavioral strategies to achieve learning outcomes. If your eyes are focused on me, you must be learning. If your body's oriented to me, you must be learning. But what children most need, and this is especially true for neurodivergent children, but it is universally true actually for children. It's just that neurotypical children can compensate better. So I'll come back to that. This is true for all children. Children really need to establish a sense of meaning in order to actually convert what they're taking in into crystallized knowledge. What sticks has to have an element of a why, a central why. And we, in my opinion, are starting to really lose that in a lot of learning spaces, a lot of academic spaces. Of course, not all. Again, this is not at all an attack on educators who are, there is no question, who are doing the most important work in our society. And it's a matter of how systems are encroaching, oppressing actual learning to take place. So children who are able to establish that meaningfulness will learn more. They will achieve more. They will have more flexible strategies to sort of play the game, right? Good test taking skills, really an awareness of exactly which behaviors matter most, being able to create a hierarchy based on differing contexts. All of those skills lead to greater success. And it starts with that ability to say, I know who I am, and I recognize other people have their own states leading to what they're asking of me.
Yeah, that's just really powerful, right? And it of course makes me believe, or start to think about how we train teachers and the things that we really highlight and focus on. And of course, knowing your content area is critical. There's no doubt about that. And also, understanding some of this conversation, understanding emotional intelligence, what it is, and how important it is in a classroom for children and adolescents. It feels like that's actually the first step to me. It's like that's where our investment really needs to be. So if you were going to give some advice to teacher preparation programs or school administrators or even educators and parents even, what would that advice be in terms of better understanding emotional intelligence? And is there skill development that can happen so that we can set up our children and our adolescents in a better way to learn as much as possible?
Absolutely. I could write a whole curriculum on this, but I'll give a couple of tips for today that I think are really key. And and I love that you named all those stakeholder groups, because this is the same advice for anyone who is creating a fertile environment, whether that's your family, your community, your classroom, your school, etc. Name your values. Before you start identifying behavioral rules, establish what the shared values are and be willing to really think them through relationally. So quick example, whenever I ask folks to do this, the first one people say is kindness. But what you'll find is that this is a great example of where you really put that empathic process into practice, where you really role model this. We all define that very differently. And so you really have to talk through with all the stakeholders, which includes the kids, what is really the shared value? What matters most to us in this environment? Once you have values, then you're able to agree on rules that are meaningful.
Sure.
Look, we all agreed that part of kindness is listening closely to what other people say. And you're not always going to be able to not interrupt. That may not, in fact, even mean that you're not listening. But what we're going to do in this, so interrupting isn't going to get a scold or a shaming or consequence, but the value is that everybody's words matter. So we need to think of 5 ways throughout the year that we can make sure that we are showing one another that we have heard what they've said and that we're reflecting on it in some way. That's just one example, right? That's how values translate into rules that everybody has agreed on. And then throw everything else out. You can have hills you die on. And my kids will tell you I have them. There are hills that I'm never going to get off of. But if everything's a hill, they'll just tune you right out. Then nothing's right? Then you have no values. So it's really useful in shaping the meaningfulness of why we even have rules in the first place based on values, if you are being really consistent about the things that matter to you. And what ends up happening a lot in classrooms and in families as well is that rules are about power. And depending on how much power you have, the rules can change. And so then we're signaling to the kids that power matters most, not relationality, not community. And so every rule in the classroom has to be something that in some form everyone is adhering to. Another really clear example of that is that families all need to have bedtimes. And if adults are saying things like only the kids have bedtime and we get to go binge Netflix and you have to stay in your room, now what the kid is hearing is if I can get more power, then I get more choices instead of everyone has a bedtime because it's about health. That's one thing. The other thing that I will say that I see happening at an alarming rate is the disintegration of adult-led values related to peer conflict. So bullying has long been a problem, and it's only gotten worse. And everybody, it seems like in society, wants to blame the kids and say they came back from the pandemic regressed. And in the interest of time, I can't weigh in on that too much, but they didn't. That's not what happened. They developed capacities in other ways, and you're seeing a reduction in the capacities that you maybe wanted or needed in the specific context. But development doesn't stop. It doesn't regress, right? But we're blaming the kids. We're saying this increase in aggression is about the kids not having manners, not being polite, not having been exposed to group environments for a period of time. And in fact, what I actually think is more true is that the pandemic increased the burden on the educational system. The adults haven't recovered, both in terms of our own wellness and in terms of our relationships with one another. And other sort of colliding crises related to school-based violence and kind of the national awakening to that has really signaled a change in how much school personnel want to be held accountable or can be held accountable, especially I'm seeing this among leadership for peer conflict. There seems to be kind of a way of thinking that if you do anything, you're potentially held liable. So it's better to have a really neutral response. And again, not everywhere, but it becomes leadership's choice in some way, right?
Yeah.
And we need supportive systems that don't require people to go out on a ledge in order to really exercise values in a system. That shouldn't be something a person has to choose to do on their own. Our systems need to support the adults in being able to collectively really reinforce this is a place where values matter.
Yeah.
And that is the most important thing before we even start talking about judgment and justice and consequences. We need to talk about how we are upholding our values to one another.
Yeah. Wow. I mean, we could have a whole separate, series of podcasts on what you're talking about right now. And this is such one of the most critical things that's happening in school systems right now, as teachers are reporting lack of support in terms of managing different types of behaviors, not actually only with students, but with parents as well.
Mm-hmm.
And feeling, not supported by their administration, and also, like, I have good friends who are administrators, and you hit the nail on the head right there. When an administrator is scared to actually do their job because they don't feel supported as well, and they're basically scared, then because of policy and legislation that has been passed, it just makes for a really difficult system to work in. So if you had some concrete skills that we could teach kids in our schools or in our homes, what would those skills be?
So one really important concrete skill that I love to see educators really engaging in, and I think there are great glimmers of this across our school system. I'm even hopeful there will be teachers listening to this who will say, oh, I do that. The extent to which we encourage flexible thinking and problem solving from a curious perspective, and then being able to segue that into how we teach kids to resolve differences of opinion. And again, very specifically, here's an example of an assignment. Typically, when we're teaching elements of debate, we are focusing on persuasion as the main sort of skill that kids need to learn in how to get their point across. But wouldn't it be interesting to craft a lesson that was less about persuasion and more about learning with somebody who thinks a different thing than you think? How are we teaching children to use empathy, to know what they think, to know that in conversation, what they think and believe is not threatened by somebody thinking and believing something else, that the goal doesn't have to be winning each other over? That's not very emotionally intelligent. That is about power. So wouldn't it be interesting to make, I hate to even call it debate, but if we can come up with a different way, right? Problem solving, shared problem solving, let's say, if we made that a curiosity exercise, and what we were rewarding was the ability to collaboratively innovate without compromise.
Yeah. Do you think we can teach this at like an early childhood level, first grade?
I actually think young children are going to be better at this.
Yeah, and it goes back to like our original conversation, right? The very beginning of this podcast.
Yeah, and I will also say, yet another thing that I think is a sort of a funny myth about kids is that they're constantly searching for control and power. And if they are doing that, it's because they are learning that the rules of engagement in their immediate people, that matters. But mostly what they're doing is that they haven't internalized the hidden curriculum that you're supposed to seek power, but not outwardly, that there's kind of this dance to do around power. They're mostly just kind of stating their internal states. They haven't yet learned that is threatening in any way. So to give them the opportunity for two truths to live side by side and actually to be generative.
Yeah.
I think there are definitely ways to do this with very young kids. You love the color green and you love the color blue. And yes, one option is to mix them together, but look at the color you get. It's a little green, it's a little blue. Mm-hmm. Is that innovative? Is that creative? The answer is no. What would it look like to combine green and blue in a totally new way?
In a different way. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
There's foundational ways to think about this and to thread it across the lifespan.
Such important skills and such an important point. I really appreciate that perspective and advice. And I do think that teaching these types of skills, even in early childhood centers, is doable and is only beneficial for not only the individual, but our communities as well. So thank you for that. I just want to thank you for coming on today. This was a really interesting conversation. I really do think that our listeners will be able to take away some really important or key points that you talked about today. And those of you who are listening, if you have any specific questions for us about anything that we talked, you can email the Scanlon Center for School Mental Health, and I can even share some of those questions with Dr. Erika Bocknek, and we can hopefully guide you in the right direction in solving some of your questions that you might have. So thank you again for coming today. It was so fun to have a conversation with you.
Thank you so much for having me. This was so exciting, and it gives me so much to think about for the rest of my day.
Yeah, same here. So, and I'm sure we'll be in touch. Have a great day.
Thank you. You too.
Bye-bye. During our discussion today about emotional intelligence, I realized what a pivotal role emotional intelligence plays in fostering healthy systems, which is something we talk a lot about on this podcast. Understanding and practicing emotional intelligence is clearly not just about improving your personal life and your relationships with others or your professional life, but it's learning about how to practice skills to improve empathy, social awareness, self awareness that can have the potential to improve systems that help individuals and communities, like I always say, thrive, not just survive. So, in essence, my conversation today about emotional intelligence just reinforced this idea that it's not just a personal skill, but it's a crucial aspect of creating a harmonious and enriching educational environment. In fact, is a critical component that needs to be firmly in place to help our students learn and for educators to do their work. I invite you to share your thoughts and your comments and suggestions with me, as always, at scsmh-main, M-A-I-N, at uiowa.edu. Until next time, I'm your host, Dr. Kari Vogelgesang, forever cheering you on.